Evelina Ashworth froze the moment she saw her fiancé's hand resting on another woman's waist. The ballroom was full of candlelight and laughter, and no one else seemed to notice what was happening behind the velvet curtain near the garden doors. But Evelina noticed. She always noticed things other people missed. That was why she had agreed to marry Julian Whitmore in the first place, because he had once told her that she saw the world more clearly than anyone he had ever met. Now she wished she had not seen this. The woman in his arms was not a stranger. It was Charlotte Bellamy, her closest friend since childhood, the same woman who had helped her choose the ribbons for her wedding gown just 3 days earlier. Charlotte's laugh, soft and familiar, drifted toward Evelina through the noise of the party, and for a moment, Evelina could not breathe. She did not scream, she did not cry out, she simply stood there, holding her glass of champagne, while the world around her tilted sideways. A servant passed by with a tray of pastries, unaware that he had just walked between a woman and the collapse of her entire future. Musicians continued playing a cheerful waltz. Somewhere across the room, her mother was speaking proudly to a group of guests about the upcoming wedding, unaware that the groom was, at that very moment, holding another woman as if she belonged to him. Evelina set her glass down on a nearby table. Her hand did not shake, though her heart pounded so hard she feared everyone could hear it. She walked toward the curtain. Julian looked up first. His face went pale, then red, then pale again, all within the span of 2 seconds. Charlotte turned next, and when she saw Evelina standing there, she stepped back so quickly that she knocked over a small vase of flowers resting on the windowsill. The sound of shattering glass cut through the music, and suddenly, heads began to turn. "Evelina," Julian said, his voice strained. "This is not what it looks like." "It looks exactly like what it is," Evelina replied. Her voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that comes right before a storm. By now, several guests nearby had stopped talking. A hush spread through that corner of the ballroom like ice creeping across a pond. Evelina could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do next. Would she cry? Would she scream? Would she faint? As so many women in her position were expected to do. She did none of those things. Instead, she looked at Charlotte, the woman she had known since they were both 6 years old, the woman who had shared her secrets, her fears, her dreams of the future. "How long?" Evelina asked quietly. Charlotte's lips trembled. "It only happened tonight, I swear it." "Don't lie to her," Julian snapped, and then seemed to realize what he had just admitted. His face went white with horror. The truth, once spoken aloud, could not be taken back. Evelina felt something inside her chest crack open, not with sadness, but with a strange, sharp clarity. She understood now. This had not been a single moment of weakness. This had been going on for some time, hidden behind smiles and secret glances she had been too trusting to notice. More guests gathered. Whispers spread like a fire catching dry grass. Someone gasped. Someone else covered their mouth. Evelina's mother appeared at the edge of the crowd, her face full of confusion that quickly turned to horror as she understood what she was seeing. "Evelina," her mother whispered, "what has happened?" Evelina did not answer right away. She kept her eyes on Julian, who now looked more like a frightened boy than the confident young lord who had proposed to her 6 months earlier with such grand promises. He had knelt before her in this very garden, holding a ring, telling her that she was the only woman he could ever love. Words, she realized now, meant nothing at all. "Nothing has happened," Evelina finally said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "Nothing that concerns anyone but myself." She turned and walked away from the curtain, from Julian, from Charlotte, from the broken vase and the spilled water soaking into the fine carpet. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she forced herself to keep her chin high, her shoulders straight, refusing to give the watching crowd the satisfaction of seeing her break. As she crossed the ballroom floor, the whispers followed her like a second shadow. She caught fragments of conversation, cruel and curious all at once. Some voices dripped with pity, others carried a thrill of scandal, the kind of gossip that would fuel drawing room conversations for weeks to come. Near the far wall, standing apart from the crowd with a glass of wine untouched in his hand, a tall stranger watched her approach. She had never seen him before tonight. He wore his dark coat with quiet authority, the kind that did not need loud words or grand gestures to command attention. His eyes, sharp and steady, followed her not with pity, but with something closer to respect. Evelina barely noticed him. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene behind the curtain over and over, searching for some sign she had missed, some moment where she should have known. She reached the entrance hall and asked a servant to call for her carriage. Her mother hurried after her, her silk skirts rustling with urgency. "Evelina, wait. We must speak with Lord Whitmore. We must fix this quietly before word spreads any further." "Fix it?" Evelina turned to face her mother, and for the first time that night, her calm composure wavered. "Mother, there is nothing to fix." He was holding Charlotte in his arms, in front of half the guests in that house. Her mother's face crumpled with worry, not for her daughter's broken heart, but for the family's reputation. "If this becomes known, no respectable man will want to marry you. We must handle this carefully." The words struck harder than anything Julian had done. Evelina realized, in that moment, that even her own mother was more concerned with appearances than with the pain her daughter felt. "I do not care what respectable men think of me," Evelina said, her voice steady once more. "I care that the man I trusted with my future betrayed me with my closest friend, in a house full of witnesses, without any shame at all." Her carriage arrived. She climbed inside without waiting for her mother's response, and as the wheels began to turn against the cobblestones, she allowed herself, finally, to close her eyes and breathe. She did not cry during the ride home. She stared out the window at the passing street lamps, watching the golden light flicker against the darkness, and she made herself a quiet promise. She would never again let herself be so easily fooled by charming words and empty promises. Behind her, in the ballroom she had left, the party continued, though the mood had shifted into something colder and sharper. Julian tried to explain himself to the small crowd that remained near him, but no explanation could undo what dozens of eyes had already witnessed. Charlotte had slipped away through a side door, unable to face the judgment in the room. And near the far wall, the tall stranger who had watched Evelina walk away, set down his untouched glass of wine, and asked a passing acquaintance a simple question. "Who is that young woman, the one who just left?" His acquaintance, an older gentleman with a fondness for gossip, seemed delighted to share the story. "That is Lady Evelina Ashworth. Her engagement to Lord Whitmore has just ended, it seems, in the most scandalous fashion possible." The stranger said nothing more, but his eyes lingered on the doorway through which she had disappeared, as though he were already thinking of a way to see her again. Evelina, unaware that she had caught the attention of anyone at all, spent that night lying awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how a life she had planned so carefully could fall apart in a single evening. She thought of the wedding gown hanging in her wardrobe, the invitations already sent, the future she had imagined with a man who, it turned out, had never truly belonged to her at all. By morning, all of society would know what had happened. But Evelina did not yet understand that this humiliating night, the worst of her life, was about to become the beginning of something far greater than she could have imagined. Somewhere across the city, in a grand house she had never visited, a man she had barely noticed was already thinking of her name. By the time the sun rose over the city, the story of what happened at the Whitmore ball had already begun to spread. Evelina heard it first from her maid, who arrived to dress her that morning with red cheeks and nervous hands, unable to meet her mistress's eyes. "The whole street is talking about it, my lady," the girl whispered as she fastened the buttons on Evelina's morning dress. "I am so sorry." Evelina said nothing. She had expected this. Gossip moved faster than any carriage in the city, and by noon, she suspected, every drawing room within 5 miles would know exactly what had happened behind that curtain. She was right. Her mother appeared at breakfast looking as though she had not slept at all. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea into a cup she did not drink from. "Lady Fenwick called on me at 8 o'clock this morning," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. 8 o'clock, Evelina. No respectable woman calls before noon unless she has news too urgent to wait. And what did Lady Fenwick want? To offer her sympathies, of course. But sympathy from that woman is worse than any insult. She practically glowed with the pleasure of it. Her mother set down the teapot with a sharp clink. "This is a disaster. Do you understand what this means for your future, for your sisters?" Evelina had 2 younger sisters, both still unmarried, both hoping to make good matches in the coming seasons. She understood, more than her mother realized, exactly what her own scandal might cost them. "I did nothing wrong," Evelina said quietly. "It does not matter what you did or did not do," her mother snapped. "In the eyes of society, a woman who is betrayed is often blamed just as much as the man who betrayed her. They will ask what you did to drive him into another woman's arms. They will say you were cold or difficult or unable to hold his affection." The unfairness of it settled over Evelina like a heavy blanket, but she refused to let it crush her. "Then let them say whatever they wish. I know the truth." Her mother did not look comforted by this at all. Over the following days, Evelina found herself the subject of every conversation she was not invited to join. Invitations to social gatherings, once plentiful, began to dwindle. Some families that had been eager to associate with the Ashworths suddenly found excuses to keep their distance, unwilling to be connected to scandal, however unfairly earned. Julian, for his part, seemed to suffer far less than Evelina did. Men, it appeared, were forgiven more easily than women. Within a week, rumors reached her that he had been seen at his club, laughing with friends as though nothing at all had happened. He had even offered a version of events that painted himself as confused and misled, suggesting that Charlotte had pursued him relentlessly, and that he bore little responsibility for what had occurred. Charlotte, meanwhile, had left the city entirely, retreating to her family's country estate to avoid the worst of the judgment. Evelina heard secondhand that her former friend had written letters attempting to explain herself, to apologize, to ask for forgiveness. Evelina did not read any of them. Some wounds, she decided, did not deserve the effort of understanding. It was nearly 2 weeks after the disastrous ball when Evelina first learned the name of the man who had watched her leave that night. She was attending a small garden gathering hosted by an old family friend, one of the few who had not abandoned her in the wake of the scandal. The afternoon was warm, the roses in full bloom, and Evelina had hoped for a quiet hour away from prying eyes and whispered judgments. Instead, she found herself the topic of hushed conversation once again, though this time, the whispers carried a different kind of curiosity. "Did you hear?" one young woman murmured to her companion, just loud enough for Evelina to catch the words as she passed, "that the Duke of Renfield has been asking after Lady Ashworth." Evelina's steps slowed, though she did not stop walking. "The Duke of Renfield?" the second woman replied, her voice rising with surprise. "Surely not. He has shown no interest in courting anyone since his return from the continent. I heard it from Lady Pembroke herself. He asked about her by name, the very night of the scandal, before he even knew who she was." Evelina forced herself to continue walking, pretending she had heard nothing at all, though her mind raced with questions. She knew the name Renfield, of course. Everyone did. Duke Alistair Renfield was one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the country, known for his sharp intelligence, his fair dealings, and his complete disinterest in the usual games of courtship that consumed so much of society's attention. He had inherited his title young, after the sudden death of his father, and had spent the years since building a reputation as a man who valued substance over charm. Why would such a man take any interest in her? She did not have to wait long for an answer. 3 days later, an invitation arrived at the Ashworth household, sealed with the unmistakable crest of the Renfield family. Evelina's mother nearly dropped the tea tray when she saw it. "A private invitation," her mother breathed, turning the envelope over in her hands as though it might disappear if she looked away. "From the Duke himself, to attend a small dinner at his estate." "Why would he invite me?" Evelina asked, though a small, cautious hope had already begun to stir in her chest, one she quickly tried to suppress. She had learned, painfully, not to trust flattering attention from powerful men. "I do not know," her mother admitted, though her earlier panic had transformed into something closer to excitement. "But Evelina, you must accept, this could change everything. If the Duke shows you favor, even the harshest gossips will have no choice but to reconsider their judgment of you." Evelina studied the elegant handwriting on the envelope, her name written with careful precision. She thought of the stranger she had barely noticed at the ball, the man with steady eyes who had watched her walk away from her own humiliation without looking away in discomfort, as so many others had. She decided, against every instinct telling her to retreat from society entirely, to accept the invitation. The evening of the dinner arrived faster than she expected. Evelina dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep blue silk that made her feel like herself again, rather than the pitiful figure society had painted her as in recent weeks. Her mother fussed over her hair until Evelina gently asked her to stop, needing a moment of calm before facing whatever awaited her. The Renfield estate was grander than she had imagined, its halls lined with paintings and its gardens stretching farther than she could see in the fading evening light. A servant led her to a private dining room where, to her surprise, only a handful of guests had been invited, far fewer than she expected for a formal dinner. Duke Alistair Renfield rose from his seat the moment she entered the room. He was taller than she remembered, his dark hair slightly disheveled in a way that suggested he cared little for the careful styling other gentlemen favored. His eyes, the same steady gray she recalled from that terrible night, met hers directly, without the pitying softness she had grown so tired of receiving from others. "Lady Ashworth," he said, his voice deep and measured, "thank you for accepting my invitation." "I confess, Your Grace, I was uncertain why I received it," Evelina replied honestly, deciding that pretense would serve neither of them well. A faint smile touched his lips, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. I find myself drawn to people who handle difficulty with dignity rather than despair. I witnessed something of that quality in you, the night of your betrothal ball. Evelina felt heat rise to her cheeks, though not from embarrassment this time. You saw what happened. I did, and I saw how you chose to leave that room, not as a woman defeated, but as one who refused to be diminished by another person's poor choices. The words settled over her like warmth after a long, cold winter. No one, not even her own mother, had spoken to her about that night in such terms. Everyone else had treated her as a victim to be pitied, a cautionary tale, a woman whose future had been irreparably damaged. This man, this powerful stranger, seemed to see something different entirely. Throughout dinner, their conversation flowed more easily than Evelina had expected. The Duke asked thoughtful questions about her interests, her opinions on matters most men dismissed as unimportant for a woman to consider, her thoughts on the books she had read, and the places she hoped to visit someday. He listened, truly listened, in a way Julian never had, always more concerned with hearing his own voice than understanding hers. As the evening drew to a close, the Duke walked her to her waiting carriage himself, rather than leaving the task to a servant. I hope, he said, standing beside the carriage door, that this will not be our last conversation, Lady Ashworth. I hope so as well, Your Grace, she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of her own words. As her carriage pulled away from the grand estate, Evelina allowed herself, for the first time since that terrible night at the ball, to feel something other than anger or humiliation. A small, cautious flicker of hope had begun to grow inside her, though she reminded herself to guard it carefully. She did not yet know that Julian Whitmore, hearing whispers of the Duke's sudden interest in his former fiancée, had already begun to feel the first stirrings of jealousy, a feeling that would soon drive him to make choices he would come to regret. Word of the private dinner at the Renfield estate spread through the city faster than Evelina could have imagined. Within days, she noticed a shift in how people treated her. Invitations that had dried up in the weeks following the scandal suddenly began arriving again, filled with warm words and flattering requests for her company. Women who had once whispered cruel judgments behind their fans now smiled at her in the street, eager to be seen speaking with the woman who had caught the attention of the Duke of Renfield. Evelina found the sudden reversal almost as unsettling as the scandal itself. The same people who had judged her so harshly now judged her worthy again, not because anything about her character had changed, but because a powerful man had shown her favor. It confirmed something she had already begun to suspect. Society's opinion had very little to do with truth, and everything to do with status. Still, she could not deny the effect the Duke's attention had on her own spirits. For the first time since the disastrous ball, she found herself looking forward to something, rather than merely enduring each day as it came. 2 weeks after their dinner, Evelina attended a garden party hosted by Lady Pembroke, one of the most respected hostesses in the city. The event drew a large crowd, eager to enjoy the warm afternoon and the elaborate refreshments laid out beneath silk canopies across the sprawling lawn. She had not expected the Duke to be present, though she found herself scanning the crowd for him regardless, a habit she was slightly embarrassed to admit to herself. She found him near the edge of the garden, engaged in conversation with an older gentleman, though his eyes lifted to meet hers the moment she stepped onto the lawn, as though he had sensed her arrival before actually seeing her. He excused himself from his conversation and made his way toward her with unhurried confidence, ignoring the curious glances that followed his every movement. Lady Ashworth, he greeted her, his voice carrying just enough warmth to feel personal, without drawing unwanted attention from the surrounding guests. I had hoped you might attend today. Lady Pembroke's gardens are said to be the finest in the city, Evelina replied, though her genuine smile suggested his presence played a larger role in her pleasure than the flowers did. I could hardly resist the invitation. They walked together along the garden paths, trailing slightly behind the main crowd, close enough to remain within propriety, yet far enough to speak without every word being overheard by curious ears. The Duke asked about her family, her sisters, the small details of her daily life that most suitors never bothered to inquire about, more interested in impressing her than truly knowing her. May I ask you something personal, Your Grace? Evelina said, as they paused beside a small fountain, its water catching the afternoon sunlight in shimmering patterns. Of course. Why did you take such interest in me? That night at the ball. You did not know me at all. You had never even spoken to me before that evening. The Duke considered the question carefully before answering, as though he wanted to give her the truth rather than a convenient response. I have attended countless balls and dinners over the years, Lady Ashworth. I have watched dozens of women weep, faint, or flee in shame when faced with public humiliation, and I understand why. Society teaches women that their worth depends entirely on the approval of others, but you did none of those things. You stood tall, you spoke with composure, and you walked away with your dignity intact, even as an entire room watched your engagement collapse before your eyes. He paused, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. I have met very few people, man or woman, capable of such strength in a moment of true crisis. I found myself wanting to know more about the woman behind that composure. Evelina felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. No one had ever spoken to her with such honesty, such genuine admiration for something other than her appearance or her family standing. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Those words mean more to me than you may realize." Their quiet moment was interrupted, however, by an unwelcome voice calling out from across the garden. "Lady Ashworth, what a pleasant surprise." Evelina's stomach tightened as she turned to see Julian Whitmore approaching, dressed in his finest coat, wearing the same confident smile he had always used to charm his way through any difficult situation. Beside him walked a young woman Evelina did not recognize, clinging to his arm with obvious pride at being seen with him. "Lord Whitmore," Evelina replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I did not expect to see you here today." "Lady Pembroke's parties are rarely missed by anyone of importance," Julian said smoothly, though his eyes flicked toward the Duke standing beside her with poorly concealed curiosity. "Your Grace, I do not believe we have been formally introduced." "Whitmore," the Duke acknowledged, his tone polite but distinctly cool. "I am familiar with your name." Something flickered across Julian's face, a brief flash of unease that he quickly masked with another charming smile. "I hope only pleasant things have reached your ears. I make my own judgments of a man's character, based on his actions rather than his reputation," the Duke replied evenly, and though his words remained perfectly courteous, the implication behind them was unmistakable. Julian's smile tightened at the edges, but he pressed on regardless, clearly determined to reassert some measure of control over a conversation that had quickly shifted beyond his comfort. "Evelina, might I have a private word, just for a moment?" "I do not believe that would be appropriate," Evelina said, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. "Whatever you wish to say, you may say here." Julian's jaw tightened, his composure slipping for just a moment before he recovered it. "Very well. I merely wish to say that I hope there are no lingering hard feelings between us. What happened at the ball was unfortunate, but surely enough time has passed that we might behave civilly toward one another, for the sake of our family's connections, if nothing else." The audacity of his words struck Evelina like a physical blow. He spoke of the worst humiliation of her life, as though it were a minor social inconvenience, something to be smoothed over with polite conversation rather than genuine remorse. "Civility," Evelina said slowly, "requires honesty, Lord Whitmore. I have not heard a single honest word from you since that night." The young woman on Julian's arm shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension building between them, though she said nothing, likely unaware of the full history behind the exchange. "I only wish to move forward, as you clearly have," Julian said, his eyes darting pointedly toward the Duke. "Then move forward," Evelina replied, "but do so without expecting my forgiveness, and without involving yourself in matters that no longer concern you." For a long moment, Julian said nothing, his expression caught somewhere between anger and wounded pride. Finally, he offered a stiff bow and led his companion away, though not before casting one final glance back at the Duke, a look that carried unmistakable resentment. Once he was out of earshot, Evelina let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. "I apologize for that unpleasant exchange, Your Grace." "There is nothing to apologize for," the Duke said, his expression softening as he looked at her. "You handled him with far more grace than he deserved." They continued their walk through the gardens, though Evelina noticed the Duke's demeanor had shifted slightly, a new watchfulness in his gaze whenever Julian's name arose in conversation. She did not yet understand the full weight of what she had witnessed in Julian's eyes, a jealousy that ran far deeper than simple wounded pride. As the afternoon light began to fade, and guests started departing the garden party, the Duke walked Evelina to her waiting carriage once more, just as he had after their private dinner. "Lady Ashworth," he said, his voice quieter now, more deliberate, "I find myself wishing to see you again, not merely at social gatherings surrounded by curious onlookers, but in more meaningful conversation. Would you permit me to call on you properly, with your family's blessing?" Evelina's heart quickened at the request, though she forced herself to remain composed. "I would welcome that, Your Grace." A genuine smile broke across his face then, unguarded and warm. the first true smile she had seen from him since they met. "Then I shall call on you this week." As her carriage pulled away, Evelina glanced back toward the garden one final time, catching sight of Julian standing near the refreshment table, his eyes fixed not on his young companion, but on the departing carriage, his expression dark with an emotion Evelina could not quite name, though she suspected, with growing unease, that it would not remain harmless for long. That evening, alone in her room, Evelina allowed herself to reflect on how dramatically her circumstances had shifted in the span of a single month. She had gone from a woman humiliated before all of society to a woman courted by one of its most respected and powerful men. Yet beneath her cautious happiness lingered a quiet unease, a sense that Julian's wounded pride might not fade quietly into the background, and that the true test of her newfound strength had not yet arrived. The Duke kept his promise. 3 days after the garden party, his carriage arrived at the Ashworth household precisely at the hour he had proposed, and from that day forward, his visits became a regular part of Evelina's week. Her mother, once so consumed by panic over the scandal, now fluttered about the house with barely contained excitement each time his carriage appeared at the gate. Evelina found herself growing genuinely fond of the Duke's company, not because of his title or his wealth, but because of the quiet respect he showed her in every conversation. He asked about her opinions on matters of business and politics, subjects most men considered unsuitable for a woman's attention, and he listened carefully to her responses, often adjusting his own views based on the insight she offered. "You think differently than most people I encounter," he told her one afternoon, as they walked through her family's modest garden, far smaller than his own grand estate, though he never once seemed to mind the difference. "Most people tell me what they believe I wish to hear. You tell me what you actually think, regardless of whether it aligns with my expectations. Is that not simply honesty, Your Grace?" Evelina asked, smiling faintly. "It is rarer than you might imagine," he replied, his gray eyes holding hers with quiet sincerity. As the weeks passed, Evelina's cautious hope grew into something steadier, something that felt dangerously close to genuine affection. She found herself thinking of him throughout her days, wondering what he might say about a passage she had read, or a piece of music she had heard, eager for his next visit in a way she had never anticipated Julian's presence, even during the earliest days of their courtship. Not everyone shared her happiness, however. Julian Whitmore, humiliated by Evelina's public rejection at the garden party and increasingly aware of the growing bond between her and the Duke, found his wounded pride transforming into something far more dangerous than simple jealousy. He began attending the same social events, seeking out any opportunity to insert himself into conversations where Evelina and the Duke were present, always with some excuse that barely concealed his true motives. At a musical evening hosted by one of the city's prominent families, Julian approached Evelina while the Duke had briefly stepped away to speak with another guest. "You seem to have recovered remarkably well from our broken engagement," Julian said, his voice carrying a bitter edge beneath its polite surface. "I wonder if the Duke knows the full truth of what happened between us." Evelina's spine stiffened. "He knows precisely what happened, Lord Whitmore. I have never hidden the truth from anyone. Have you told him everything, though?" Julian pressed, stepping closer than propriety allowed. "Have you told him how desperately you clung to our engagement, even after learning of my supposed indiscretions? How you begged me not to end things publicly, fearing the very scandal that eventually found you regardless?" The lie struck Evelina like a slap, so brazen in its falseness that she nearly laughed aloud, despite the anger building inside her. "That is not what happened, and you know it." "Do I?" Julian's smile turned cold. "Memory can be such a curious thing, Evelina. People often remember events in whatever manner suits them best." Before Evelina could respond, the Duke returned to her side, his sharp eyes immediately sensing the tension between them. "Is there a difficulty here?" "None at all," Julian said quickly, his earlier boldness evaporating beneath the Duke's steady gaze. "Merely reminiscing about old times with Lady Ashworth. I was under the impression Lady Ashworth had no fond memories of your time together worth reminiscing about," the Duke replied, his tone carrying a quiet warning that even Julian could not mistake. Julian offered a stiff bow and retreated without further comment, though the look he cast toward Evelina before leaving carried unmistakable malice. "What did he say to you?" the Duke asked, once Julian was safely out of earshot. Evelina hesitated, uncertain whether to burden him with Julian's petty lies, but ultimately decided that honesty had always served their relationship well. "He attempted to twist the truth of our engagement, suggesting I begged him to stay despite his own betrayal. It was nonsense, of course, but I worry he intends to spread such falsehoods more widely." The Duke's expression darkened, though his voice remained calm when he spoke. Men like Whitmore often resort to desperate measures when their pride has been wounded beyond repair. I would not concern yourself too greatly with his lies, Evelina. Anyone who truly knows your character will recognize falsehood when they hear it. His use of her given name, rather than the formal address he typically used in public settings, sent a small thrill through her chest, though she said nothing of it, choosing instead to simply enjoy the warmth of his reassurance. Julian's attempts at sabotage did not end with that single conversation, however. Over the following weeks, whispers began circulating through certain social circles, subtle variations of the lie he had first presented to Evelina directly. Some claimed she had been the true cause of their broken engagement, driving Julian into Charlotte's arms through her own coldness. Others suggested she had pursued the Duke's attention as a calculated scheme to salvage her damaged reputation, rather than out of any genuine affection. Evelina found the rumors deeply unsettling, though she forced herself to maintain her composure whenever they reached her ears, refusing to give Julian the satisfaction of seeing her distressed. The Duke, for his part, seemed entirely unmoved by the gossip, his confidence in Evelina's character never wavering despite the whispers surrounding them. If anything, the rumors seemed to draw him closer to her side, as though he took a certain quiet pleasure in defending her honor against those who sought to diminish it. "People will always find something to whisper about," he told her one evening, as they sat together in her family's parlor, her mother hovering nearby with poorly disguised curiosity. The measure of a person's character is not found in what others say about them, but in how they choose to live their own life regardless. Despite his reassurances, Evelina could not shake a growing sense of unease. Julian's jealousy had curdled into something darker than mere wounded pride, and she suspected he would not rest content with simple whispers and half-truths forever. Her suspicions proved correct sooner than she expected. One afternoon, while visiting a dressmaker's shop to select fabric for a new gown, Evelina encountered Charlotte for the first time since the disastrous ball. Her former friend looked thinner than Evelina remembered, her once vibrant eyes now dulled with what appeared to be genuine regret. "Evelina," Charlotte said softly, her voice trembling, "please, might we speak for just a moment?" Evelina's first instinct was to refuse, to walk away without granting Charlotte the satisfaction of an audience, but something in her former friend's expression, a genuine desperation rather than the calculated charm Julian so often employed, gave her pause. "Say what you wish to say," Evelina replied, though her tone remained guarded. "I know I do not deserve your forgiveness," Charlotte began, tears welling in her eyes. "What I did was unforgivable. I betrayed you in the worst possible way, and I have regretted it every single day since that night." "Why did you do it?" Evelina asked, the question she had never allowed herself to voice aloud until this moment. Charlotte hesitated, wringing her hands together. "I do not have a good answer. Julian pursued me relentlessly in the weeks before your engagement ball, telling me he had never truly loved you, that he only intended to marry you for your family's connections. I was foolish enough to believe him, and foolish enough to think that what we shared meant something real." "And now?" Evelina pressed. "Now I understand that he was simply using me, just as he intended to use you. He discarded me within days of our discovery, moving on to other women without a second thought. I lost my dearest friend for a man who never cared for either of us at all." Despite the anger she still carried toward Charlotte, Evelina felt a small measure of sympathy stirring within her, though it did nothing to erase the pain of the betrayal itself. "I appreciate your honesty, Charlotte, but I cannot simply forget what happened between us. Trust, once broken so completely, is not easily rebuilt." "I understand," Charlotte said, wiping tears from her cheeks. "I only wished you to know the truth, and to warn you, if I may." "Warn me of what?" Charlotte glanced around the shop nervously, before lowering her voice further. "Julian has grown increasingly desperate since learning of the Duke's courtship. I overheard him speaking with a friend just yesterday, discussing plans to publicly humiliate you both at the Duke's upcoming ball, in whatever manner he can manage. I do not know the specifics, but I felt you deserved to know." A chill ran through Evelina at Charlotte's words, though she forced herself to remain composed. "Thank you for telling me." Charlotte nodded, then hesitated once more. "For what it is worth, I am glad you have found happiness with the Duke. You deserve far better than what Julian offered either of us." As Charlotte departed the shop, Evelina remained standing amid the bolts of colorful fabric, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just learned. Julian intended to strike at the Duke's own ball, in front of the very society that had already witnessed one humiliating scene between them. She would need to warn the Duke immediately, though she could not yet guess what form Julian's desperate scheme might take, nor how devastating its consequences might prove to be if left unchecked. Evelina wasted no time in relaying Charlotte's warning to the Duke. He listened carefully as she recounted the conversation, his expression unreadable, though the slight tightening of his jaw revealed the anger he kept carefully controlled beneath his calm exterior. "Whitmore grows bolder in his desperation," the Duke said, once she had finished, his voice low and measured. "I suspected he might attempt something of this nature, though I confess I did not expect him to target my own ball." "What will you do?" Evelina asked, unable to fully suppress the worry in her voice. The Duke considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Nothing, for now. Whatever Whitmore intends to do, he will do it believing he holds the advantage of surprise. I would rather allow him to reveal his hand at a moment of our choosing, rather than confronting him prematurely and giving him the opportunity to devise some new scheme." "You intend to let him proceed with his plan?" Evelina asked, startled by the suggestion. "I intend to be prepared for whatever he attempts," the Duke corrected gently. "There is a difference, Evelina. I will not allow him to catch either of us unaware, but I also see no benefit in confronting him before we understand precisely what he intends." Despite her lingering unease, Evelina found herself trusting the Duke's judgment, recognizing the calm strategic thinking that had likely served him well in matters far more complicated than the petty scheming of a jealous former suitor. The weeks leading up to the Duke's grand ball passed in a strange combination of anticipation and dread. Evelina continued her courtship with the Duke, their bond deepening with each passing day, though the shadow of Julian's unknown plan lingered over even their happiest moments together. The Duke, for his part, seemed entirely unbothered by the looming threat, his confidence unwavering as he continued making preparations for what promised to be the most significant social event of the season. "You seem remarkably calm, given what we know Whitmore intends," Evelina observed one evening, as they sat together reviewing the guest list for the upcoming ball. "I have faced greater threats than a jealous man's wounded pride," the Duke replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "Besides, I have learned something valuable about you these past weeks, Evelina. You possess a strength that Whitmore's schemes cannot easily shake, no matter what he attempts." His confidence proved contagious, and by the time the evening of the ball finally arrived, Evelina found herself facing the event with more determination than fear. The Renfield estate had been transformed into something out of a dream, with thousands of candles illuminating every corridor and garden pathway, musicians filling the grand ballroom with elegant melodies, and tables laden with the finest refreshments the city could offer. Evelina arrived dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk, a color she had chosen deliberately, wanting to feel strong and certain rather than delicate and vulnerable as she had felt during her disastrous engagement ball months earlier. The Duke greeted her personally at the entrance, his eyes lighting with genuine admiration as he took in her appearance. "You look magnificent, Evelina." "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, allowing herself a small smile despite the tension coiled in her stomach. Throughout the early hours of the ball, Evelina remained watchful, scanning the crowded room for any sign of Julian, though he had not yet made an appearance. She danced with the Duke twice, their movements falling into an easy rhythm that drew admiring glances from the surrounding guests, and for a brief while, she allowed herself to simply enjoy the evening, pushing aside her worries about what Julian might attempt. It was nearly midnight when Julian finally arrived, dressed in his finest attire, accompanied by two gentlemen Evelina did not recognize. His eyes swept across the ballroom until they landed on Evelina and the Duke standing together near the dance floor, and something in his expression hardened with grim determination. He approached slowly, deliberately, allowing his presence to draw the attention of nearby guests before he had even spoken a single word. "Your Grace," Julian said, offering a shallow bow that carried more mockery than respect. "What a magnificent gathering." "I must offer my congratulations on such a successful event, Whitmore," the Duke replied evenly. "I confess I did not expect you to attend." "I would not have missed this occasion for anything," Julian said, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of guests standing nearby. "After all, I understand congratulations may be in order for a different reason entirely." The Duke's expression remained carefully neutral, though Evelina felt her pulse quicken with dread. "I am not certain I understand your meaning." "Come now, Your Grace," Julian continued, his voice growing louder still, ensuring that the small crowd gathering around them could hear every word. "Surely you do not intend to keep your intentions toward Lady Ashworth a secret much longer. The entire city has watched your courtship unfold these past months. Surely tonight, of all nights, would be the perfect occasion to make your intentions known." Evelina's stomach twisted with unease, sensing the trap Julian had carefully constructed. He intended to force the Duke's hand, to pressure him into some public declaration before he was ready. or worse, to expose some perceived hesitation that Julian could then twist into further scandal. The Duke, however, seemed entirely unshaken by Julian's manipulation. He turned to face Evelina directly, his gray eyes steady and warm, ignoring the growing crowd around them entirely. "Lord Whitmore raises an interesting point," the Duke said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom. The musicians, having stopped playing as guests, turned to witness the unfolding scene, though perhaps not in the manner he intended. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and Evelina's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. "Evelina Ashworth," the Duke said, sinking to one knee before her, ignoring the gasps rippling through the crowd of astonished guests. "I have known you for only a handful of months, yet in that time, you have shown me a strength and grace unlike any I have encountered in my entire life. You faced humiliation with dignity, betrayal with honesty, and cruelty with unwavering composure. I do not offer you my hand out of pity, nor out of any desire to rescue you from scandal. I offer it because I have come to love you, deeply and completely, and because I cannot imagine my future without you standing beside me." He opened the velvet box to reveal a stunning ring, its diamond catching the candlelight in brilliant flashes. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The ballroom fell utterly silent, hundreds of guests holding their collective breath as they awaited her answer. Evelina's eyes filled with tears, though this time, they were tears of overwhelming joy rather than heartbreak. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." The ballroom erupted into applause and delighted exclamations, the sound washing over Evelina like a wave of pure happiness. The Duke rose to his feet and slipped the ring onto her finger before drawing her into an embrace, entirely unconcerned with the propriety such a public display might typically demand. Julian stood frozen amid the celebrating crowd, his carefully constructed scheme having backfired in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Rather than exposing weakness or hesitation, he had inadvertently provided the perfect stage for the Duke's genuine declaration of love, transforming what he intended as humiliation into Evelina's greatest triumph. "This is absurd," Julian said, his voice rising with barely controlled fury as he pushed forward through the crowd. "You cannot possibly intend to marry a woman with her reputation, Your Grace. Everyone here knows the scandal that surrounds her." The crowd's celebratory mood shifted instantly into tense silence at Julian's outburst, all eyes turning toward him with open disapproval. "The only scandal I am aware of," the Duke said, his voice cold and controlled, "involves a man who betrayed his own fiancée with her closest friend, then spent months afterwards spreading vicious lies in a desperate attempt to salvage his own reputation at her expense." Gasps rippled through the crowd once more, and Evelina noticed several guests turning to whisper among themselves, their expressions shifting from curiosity to open disdain directed at Julian. "That is not," Julian began, but the Duke cut him off with a raised hand. "I know precisely what happened, Whitmore, because I have taken the time to learn the truth, rather than accepting convenient lies. I know of the false rumors you spread suggesting Lady Ashworth begged you to remain in your engagement despite your infidelity. I know of your attempts to sabotage her reputation at every opportunity these past months, and I know that tonight, you arrived at my home with the express intention of humiliating her once again, though your scheme has clearly failed in spectacular fashion." The crowd's disapproval turned openly hostile, several guests moving away from Julian as though his very presence might taint them by association. Julian's face flushed with humiliation, the very outcome he had hoped to inflict upon Evelina now falling squarely upon his own shoulders instead. "You will regret this," Julian hissed, though his threat carried little weight amid the crowd's obvious contempt. "I sincerely doubt that," the Duke replied calmly. "Now, I believe it would be best if you took your leave, Lord Whitmore. You are no longer welcome in my home." Julian glanced around the ballroom, searching for some sympathetic face among the crowd, but found none. Even the two gentlemen who had accompanied him earlier had quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with a man so thoroughly disgraced before society's watchful eyes. With no other option remaining, Julian turned and stormed from the ballroom, his footsteps echoing through the suddenly quiet hall as he made his humiliating exit. Once he had gone, the celebratory mood returned to the ballroom, guests surrounding Evelina and the Duke with warm congratulations and genuine well wishes. Evelina, still absorbing the whirlwind of emotions from the past few minutes, found herself laughing with pure, unguarded joy for the first time in what felt like years. The Duke drew her close once more, his eyes warm with affection as he looked down at her. "I apologize if my proposal came sooner than you might have expected." "Do not apologize," Evelina said, smiling up at him. "It was perfect, precisely because it was honest, and because it came from your heart rather than any scheme or calculation." As the musicians resumed their playing and the ballroom filled once more with dancing and laughter, Evelina realized that the very room where Julian had hoped to humiliate her had instead become the setting for the happiest moment of her life, a triumph she owed not to luck, but to her own unwavering strength, and to a man who had recognized that strength from the very beginning. News of the engagement spread through the city even faster than the scandal that had preceded it months earlier. Unlike the whispers of humiliation that had once followed Evelina wherever she went, these new whispers carried admiration and delight, the story of her proposal becoming the most celebrated tale of the entire season. Women who had once distanced themselves from her now sought her friendship eagerly, while mothers with unmarried daughters studied her example, hoping their own children might one day capture the attention of a man as respected as the Duke of Renfield. Evelina found the sudden shift in public opinion almost amusing, given how little her own character had changed throughout the entire ordeal. She had been the same woman during her darkest humiliation as she was during her greatest triumph, yet society's perception of her worth had swung wildly between the two extremes, dependent entirely on the attention of powerful men rather than any true understanding of who she actually was. Still, she chose not to dwell on the unfairness of it all, focusing instead on the genuine happiness that had settled into her life since accepting the Duke's proposal. Wedding preparations began almost immediately, with Evelina's mother throwing herself into the planning with an enthusiasm that bordered on overwhelming. Fittings for gowns, discussions of flowers and music, decisions about guest lists and seating arrangements filled Evelina's days, though she found herself grateful for the distraction, and even more grateful for the Duke's steady presence throughout the entire process. "Your mother seems determined to plan the grandest wedding the city has ever witnessed," the Duke observed one afternoon, watching with quiet amusement as Evelina's mother debated the merits of various flower arrangements with a harried assistant. "I believe she intends to erase every memory of my previous engagement through sheer force of celebration," Evelina replied, laughing softly at her mother's enthusiasm. "Whatever brings her joy," the Duke said, taking Evelina's hand gently in his own. "Though I confess, I care far less about the grandeur of the ceremony than I do about the woman I will be marrying at the end of it." Such moments of quiet affection had become increasingly common between them, each conversation deepening the bond that had begun so unexpectedly on the night of Evelina's original humiliation. She found herself marveling at times at how completely her life had transformed since that terrible evening, how the very worst moment of her existence had ultimately led her toward a happiness she could scarcely have imagined. Julian Whitmore, meanwhile, found his own circumstances rapidly deteriorating in the aftermath of his failed scheme at the Duke's ball. Word of his public humiliation spread just as quickly as news of the engagement, and within weeks, he found himself increasingly isolated from the social circles that had once welcomed him so eagerly. Invitations to gatherings dried up entirely. Friends who had once sought his company began finding excuses to avoid him, unwilling to associate themselves with a man so thoroughly disgraced before society's watchful eyes. Even his own family, embarrassed by the scandal he had brought upon their name, began distancing themselves from his increasingly desperate attempts to salvage his reputation. Evelina heard occasional updates about his circumstances through mutual acquaintances, though she found she no longer felt any particular satisfaction in his downfall, nor any lingering resentment toward the man who had once caused her such pain. He had simply become irrelevant to her life, a chapter closed and forgotten in favor of the future stretching brightly ahead of her. Charlotte, in contrast, seemed to be slowly rebuilding her own reputation through quiet acts of genuine contrition. She had remained largely withdrawn from society since their conversation at the dressmaker's shop, focusing instead on charitable work that gradually earned her a measure of respect independent of the scandal that had once defined her. Evelina encountered her occasionally at social gatherings in the months leading up to the wedding, and though their friendship could never fully return to what it once had been, a cautious civility developed between them, built on Charlotte's genuine remorse and Evelina's gradual willingness to release the anger she had carried for so long. "I am glad you have found happiness," Charlotte told her during one such encounter, her smile genuine despite the lingering sadness in her eyes. "You deserve it, more than anyone I know." "Thank you, Charlotte," Evelina replied, and found that she meant the words sincerely. As the wedding day approached, Evelina found herself reflecting often on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. The humiliation of that first terrible night, the painful weeks of gossip and judgment that followed, the unexpected kindness of a stranger who had seen strength where others saw only scandal, and the slow, steady growth of a love built on genuine respect rather than empty promises. The wedding itself arrived on a bright autumn morning, the church filled with more guests than Evelina had ever imagined possible, each eager to witness the union that had captured the entire city's attention throughout the preceding months. Evelina walked down the aisle dressed in a gown of ivory silk, her heart steady and certain in a way it had never been during her previous engagement. The Duke waited for her at the altar, his eyes shining with unmistakable love as he watched her approach, and Evelina felt, for the first time in her life, a complete and unshakable certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Their vows were simple, honest, spoken with genuine feeling rather than rehearsed formality. When the Duke slipped a golden band onto her finger, sealing their union before family, friends, and the watchful eyes of society, Evelina felt the last remnants of her old pain finally, completely dissolve, replaced entirely by a happiness she had once feared she might never find again. The celebration that followed lasted long into the evening, filled with music, laughter, and genuine warmth from guests who had come to witness not merely a union of titles and wealth, but a genuine love story that had triumphed over betrayal and humiliation. Late in the evening, as the celebrations continued around them, the Duke drew Evelina aside to a quiet corner of the garden, away from the noise and attention of their guests. "Do you have any regrets, my love?" he asked softly, taking her hands in his own beneath the starlit sky. Evelina considered the question carefully before answering. "I once believed that terrible night would define the rest of my life, that I would forever be known as the woman who was humiliated and betrayed. I could not have imagined, standing in that ballroom all those months ago, that it would instead become the beginning of the greatest happiness I have ever known. Sometimes," the Duke said, drawing her closer, "our darkest moments become the very foundation upon which our brightest futures are built." Evelina smiled up at him, her heart full of a contentment she had once feared she might never experience. "I am grateful, more than I can express, that you were there to witness my darkest moment, and that you chose to see strength rather than pity." "I am the fortunate one, Evelina," the Duke replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You have taught me more about genuine courage and grace than any lesson I encountered throughout my entire life." As the night deepened around them, the two stood together beneath the stars, their future stretching ahead of them with all the promise of genuine love, built not on empty words or grand gestures, but on mutual respect, honesty, and an unshakable belief in each other's worth. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy Evelina's future had, in the end, become the very catalyst that led her toward a happiness far greater than anything she had once planned for herself, proving that even the darkest betrayals could sometimes pave the way toward the brightest of new beginnings. A year passed since the wedding that had captivated the entire city, and Evelina found herself settled comfortably into her new life as the Duchess of Renfield, a role she had once never imagined for herself, yet one that suited her far more naturally than she could have anticipated. The Renfield estate, once a quiet and somewhat lonely place before her arrival, had transformed into a warm and welcoming home, filled with laughter and genuine affection between husband and wife. Evelina had taken an active interest in managing certain aspects of the estate, surprising many who had expected her to remain a purely decorative figure within her husband's grand household. The Duke, however, encouraged her involvement wholeheartedly, valuing her sharp intelligence just as much after their marriage as he had during their courtship. "You have a mind for business that many men in my position would envy," he told her one afternoon, as she reviewed a set of accounts spread across his study desk, offering suggestions that even his most experienced advisors had overlooked. "I am fortunate that society's narrow expectations never dulled your natural talents." Their marriage had become a genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than the empty performance of affection that Evelina had once mistaken for love during her engagement to Julian. She often found herself grateful for the painful lesson that betrayal had taught her, understanding now the vast difference between charming words and genuine devotion. Word had reached them, occasionally, of Julian's continued decline in society's estimation. Unable to secure another advantageous engagement following the scandal of his failed scheme at the Duke's ball, he had eventually retreated from the city entirely, settling into a quiet, largely forgotten existence at his family's country estate. Evelina felt no particular satisfaction in his downfall, though she recognized a certain justice in the consequences he now faced, consequences born entirely of his own choices rather than any deliberate cruelty on her part. Charlotte, meanwhile, had continued her quiet path toward redemption, eventually finding genuine happiness with a modest gentleman farmer who valued her kindness and had no interest in the scandal that once surrounded her name. Evelina received an invitation to Charlotte's own wedding some months after her own, and though their friendship could never fully return to its former closeness, she attended the ceremony with genuine well wishes for her former friend's happiness, understanding that forgiveness, while not the same as forgetting, could still bring a measure of peace to old wounds. Evelina's own family had flourished in the wake of her transformed circumstances. Her younger sisters, once feared to be doomed by association with their sister's scandal, found their own prospects greatly improved by the respectability of her marriage to the Duke. Both eventually secured happy matches of their own, marriages built on genuine affection rather than desperate necessity, a fact that brought Evelina immense satisfaction whenever she considered how differently their futures might have unfolded had she succumbed to despair during those darkest weeks following her own broken engagement. As the second year of her marriage began, Evelina discovered she was expecting their first child, news that filled the Renfield household with joyful anticipation. The Duke, normally so composed and measured in his public demeanor, could barely contain his excitement, spending hours discussing possible names and making plans for the nursery, his usual reserve entirely abandoned in favor of genuine, unguarded happiness. "I never imagined I could feel such complete contentment," he confessed to Evelina one quiet evening, as they sat together in their private drawing room, her hand resting gently over the small curve of her stomach. "Before I met you, I had resigned myself to a life of dutiful obligation, a marriage arranged for convenience and status rather than genuine affection. You have shown me something far greater than I ever believed possible for myself. And you showed me," Evelina replied softly, "that true strength is not found in avoiding pain entirely, but in facing it with dignity, and allowing it to lead you toward something better, rather than allowing it to define you forever." Their daughter was born on a bright spring morning, greeted with immense joy by both parents and by the wider household staff who had grown to genuinely love their kind and thoughtful Duchess over the preceding years. Evelina watched her husband hold their newborn daughter with an expression of pure wonder, and felt, in that moment, an overwhelming gratitude for the strange, painful path that had ultimately led her toward this precise moment of complete happiness. Looking back on the terrible night that had once threatened to destroy her entire future, Evelina found herself grateful, rather than resentful, for the painful lessons that betrayal had taught her. She had learned to recognize genuine character beneath charming words, to value her own strength rather than depending on the approval of others, and to understand that even the darkest moments of humiliation could ultimately become the foundation for a happiness far greater than anything she had once imagined for herself. The story of her humiliating betrayal, once the subject of scandalous gossip throughout the entire city, had gradually transformed into something else entirely within the collective memory of society. A tale not of shame, but of resilience, dignity, and the unexpected triumph of genuine love over cruel deception. Young women, facing their own heartbreaks and betrayals in the years that followed, occasionally found comfort in Evelina's story, understanding that even the most devastating humiliation need not define the entirety of one's future. Evelina herself rarely spoke of that terrible night at her original engagement ball, preferring instead to focus on the genuine happiness that had grown from its painful beginnings. Yet whenever she did reflect on those difficult months, she felt nothing but quiet gratitude, understanding that without that devastating betrayal, she might never have discovered the genuine, steadfast love that had ultimately defined the rest of her life. As she stood in the nursery one evening, watching her husband gently rock their daughter to sleep, humming a soft tune beneath his breath, Evelina allowed herself a final, peaceful reflection on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy her had instead become the unlikely beginning of everything she now held dear, proof that even life's most painful betrayals could sometimes lead toward its greatest and most unexpected blessings.